Plato time! Let's finally review Plato, the Republic. I'm new to philosophy, and I picked up Plato's Symposium because it was fairly short, and I thought, why not? But I was very happily surprised. It was very good. It felt like looking through a window of time where you join the dinner table of ancient Greek philosophers discussing through the night their thoughts on eros, their desires, and it was very nice. And again, I was very happily surprised how much I enjoyed it. For those of you who don't know, it's a dialogue between two people or a couple people with different views and somehow coming to some form of conclusion. And I find this style of writing to be so much more engaging and immersing. Plato's writing is about coming to a conclusion together. And Plato himself, self-admittedly, doesn't have all the answers. Plato, the Republic, is a very controversial piece of literature. It challenges fundamental ideas, not just around society, but also how we view our own lives in ways that might feel a bit uncomfortable. It probably should make you feel uncomfortable, and I think that's a lot of times the point, as a way to challenge ideas. I think most people wouldn't agree with all the ideas of Plato, and Plato himself doesn't agree with all his ideas. First of all, I think it's important to understand why this book was written, to fully understand where the ideas came from. Basically, Plato lived in 428 BC in Athens, Greek. They had massive leaps in not just philosophy, but art, literature, biology, all of this while simultaneously fighting two wars, the Persian War and the Peloponnesian War. So during the Persian War, where the Greeks were vastly outnumbered, the way they defeat the Persians was from coming together. All the different city-states of Greece came together, and all the states came together and just be like, no, Persia, go away, and they did it. But after this war, after defeating the Persians, instead of all the states coming together, they broke apart and they fought against each other in a civil war known as the Peloponnesian War, where they fought against who should be the ruler of the city-states. And eventually Athens lost. Plato, who lived during this time, he saw the effects of this war. And I think keeping this in mind is important for some of the more crazy ideas that are proposed in the Republic, because Plato wanted to avoid civil war at all costs, and I think keeping that in mind is important. The second reason, I think, is because Athens at this time was a democracy, and that was something that the Athenians were very proud of. It's something that was part of their character, and it was something that they greatly upheld. But in 399 BC, Socrates, the philosopher, was executed under this democracy. And I think this is something that really affected Plato and also shaped ideas for the Republic. So then, what was Plato's and Socrates' relationship? Socrates was a philosopher. He is a historical figure that did exist. The thing is that he never wrote down any of his work, and it was Plato who basically did this. But Plato writes his work in the Republic as a dialogue, where Socrates is the main character. And obviously we can't know for sure to what level of accuracy the dialogue actually occurred. Most likely it wasn't that accurate. So then, what is the Republic about? Well, Socrates is famously not interested in finding relative solutions. He wants to find absolute truths. Socrates is famous for trapping his opponents with his "what is it" question, to give a definition of something. And the Republic begins with such a question, such a "what is it" question. In book 1, the novel begins with Socrates. He is walking home from a religious festival, and he stumbles into some acquaintances who convince him to come over to their place. He sort of half reluctantly accepts. Let's focus on Cephalus first. Cephalus is an older man, and the dialogue begins with this "what is it" question coming from Socrates, who asks Cephalus, what's it like to be so old? This could be seen as a very rude question to ask someone, but Socrates wants to spark a conversation. Cephalus responds saying that, well, I enjoy being old. I no longer feel controlled by eros. My desires doesn't control him anymore. He looked forward to being rewarded in his next life because he's lived an honest life and lived up to his legal dues. And Socrates goes, got him. You just gave me a definition of justice. Living an honest life and living up to your legal dues. Socrates challenges Cephalus' view even further and says, well, if justice is living up to your legal dues, then let's say, for example, you borrow an axe from a friend because you need to chop some wood. And then later on, your friend demands to have the axe back, but the friend has gone completely insane. Would you still give the axe back to him? Obviously not. You wouldn't give a weapon to a crazy person. So in that regard, no, justice is not living up to your legal obligations. Cephalus, who's old, is not interested in this conversation, and he bids his farewell and leaves the group. But there are some younger remaining people in the group who has been listening, and they give their opinion on it instead. One of them being Thrasymachus. They are the enemy of Plato and Socrates, you can say, because they are not interested in finding absolute truth, and they're just more interested in winning an argument. So Thrasymachus gives his definition of justice and says justice is the advantage of the stronger. He's saying that it pays off more to be unjust than to be just, and people who are unjust naturally progress in society, and justice is a restraint put on us, stopping our natural desires. Socrates then responds by saying, well, if justice is in the advantage of the stronger, do people make mistakes? Yes, people make mistakes. Socrates asks, well, do rulers make mistakes? And of course, Thrasymachus says, yes, rulers can make mistakes. And then he finishes by saying, well, if you are a ruler and you put up a tax policy that will benefit you, you will get more money from the people, and you'll raise the taxes. But the ruler is doing what they think is just. But let's say then that this new tax policy basically bleeds the city dry. There's no more money left. It will end up hurting the ruler because he's left with less than what he had from the beginning, and he can no longer acquire anything from its citizens. Therefore, justice is not in fact in the advantage of the stronger. Glaucon, who is another member of the party, wants a better definition of justice. Is a just life superior to an unjust life? Glaucon brings up a very interesting example. Glaucon says that justice is a social bond, a contract between people. We have a natural desire to wanting to gain more, and the only reason we don't act unjust is because we don't want unjust things to happen to ourselves. And if the whole world acted unjust, then everyone would just stand to lose from it. So therefore, it's a social contract, his view of justice. Justice comes from weakness, and it comes from fear. And he brings up this example of the ring of Gyges. If you had a ring that could render you invisible, would you still act just? If you could do something unjust and no one would know about it, would you do it? And Glaucon argues that anyone with this ring, even the most just person, would still act unjust. Whenever people ask me what my superpower ability would be, I always thought, okay, well, what superpower could I get that would benefit me the most and not face any consequences? So I think this definition fits in pretty well. And I think it fits in with actually what a lot of people look at justice. Adeimantus joins into the conversation as well, and he says that justice itself isn't desirable, and that we only act just because we want to be rewarded in the afterlife. So therefore, Adeimantus and Glaucon want Socrates to prove to them that justice in itself is desirable. And to prove that justice is superior, he brings up the analogy of the human in a macro perspective of a city. It's called the city-soul analogy. And so, to craft this society, Socrates says that each person in this city must specialize. To maximize the efficiency of the city, he wants a shoemaker to focus solely on making shoes, a doctor to solely focus on doing doctor things. So this city will initially just start off with farmers, craftsmen, doctors. The city will live with just what is necessary and won't go beyond that. And Socrates calls that this city is healthy because of this. But Glaucon, however, has a very different view on it. He thinks that people have a natural desire for more. People have a natural desire for luxury, better entertainment, better food. So he argues that they will want to eat meat in this city. To have meat in the city, you need more land. And to have more land, you need to go to war. And therefore, They both agree that this is a natural progression and that war is inevitable in this city. And therefore, a new class of people is introduced in the Republic, which is the warriors. By Socrates' idea of specialization, warriors can only be warriors and nothing else. And he describes this highly spirited individual. And these highly spirited individuals make for great warriors, but they are hard to control. You want to be able to control them so they don't become thugs and break the laws, but you also don't want them to become too wimpy as well. So Socrates proposes that the best way to contain these warriors is through education. So it's important that these warriors are educated to act upon the will of the city. How do we do that? The classic legends of Homer will be censored in the city because the stories of Homer and other works show dying as something really bad. And that's not, he cannot allow these work of fiction to be shaping the souls of the warriors. Socrates goes through in great detail what will be allowed, not just in literature, but also music, what kind of instrument, and even what type of notes will be allowed. But this all falls under a very interesting topic of censorship. It's something that we've all been affected by ever since growing up. Our parents censor certain things from us when we are children, and Socrates sees the city and its people in the same way, where the city would be a mother censoring certain things for their child. I think the number one point against censorship is that there's a natural curiosity towards things that aren't allowed. I think most people can relate to wanting to do something more because they weren't allowed to do it. If a mother is a stripper and maybe they don't want their child to go through the same career path, then they might lie about what their job is before they go to work every day. They might say, I'm going to, I don't know, the bank instead, to protect their child. They do this to protect their child because they don't want them to follow the same path. But eventually, let's say a couple of years down the line, the child finds out the truth, and this sort of trust between a mother and a child has been broken because of their censorship, and maybe the damage would have been, the damage of that is much more than what would have been if the parent had just said the truth. Is the negative effect of what's being censored really more than what is positive? Does video games really cause violence? And I think by censorship, you are implying that you know better. The next topic of the Republic is another controversial idea. In this city that Socrates describes, there will be doctors, of course, but these doctors will not treat anyone. If you get wounded in battle, of course, the doctor will treat you, but any form of self-inflicted injury will not be taken care of. Then it gets a little darker. Socrates would probably argue for euthanasia. If you have a chronic illness, you are then just costing this city a bunch of money and resources, and therefore you will be thanked for your service in this city, but you will also be put to sleep. The third controversial idea, 3 in a row, is the myth of metals, which is another idea proposed by Socrates, and it's a lie told by the city to its citizens that they don't have any mother or father and that they came from the earth. That's right. And I think the purpose of this is pretty obvious. It's so that you will look at the state as your parent. Perhaps the silliest bit out of the myth of metals, which is that everyone is born not just from the earth, but into different categories. So you will be born either into bronze, silver, or gold category. And depending on that, which will determine what sort of job and what group of society you fit into. There's a lot of famous dystopians written around this sort of ideas, I think. We have dystopian novels such as 1984, Brave New World, We by Zevietin. And these were authors who lived to see the effect of communism and totalitarianism, and probably written as a reaction to that. We have Brave New World, which really fits into the Socratic idea of the myth of metals, where all the people in this novel are born from test labs. They don't have a mother or father. They are born in this factories, and they also fit into these groups as well. They are born into this different ranked groups in society, and everyone is happy with being part of their own group. Big Brother, of course, also with the idea of the state being this family figure almost. I don't know if that really fits, but you understand my point. We Sovietin, where there is no individualism, you are born as a number, and as the name implies itself, it's all about the group and not your own well-being, basically. According to Socrates, there will be no money in this city, which is a very interesting topic in itself as well. Adeimantus, he loves gold. He sees this as something preposterous, and he says that if there's no gold, then the city won't be able to defend itself, because no one will come to its aid if they can't pay them. But Socrates claims that any neighboring city will happily come to its aid because they have obviously the best warriors. Since they have the best warriors, that doesn't care about money. There will be everything left after the battle to plunder for themselves. Since this city does not permit it. I think Socrates recognizes that money is not necessarily a good, but it's also not necessarily something bad. I think money is good if you spend it well, but it's not as if I have a pile of money at home that I worship and that it in itself brings me joy. When you have money, you worry about losing money, and you can take, for example, anyone at the stock market. It seems like a very stressful profession, and I think a lot of people have the view that if only they had money, then they would be happy. But there's so many examples of people winning the lottery and then turning up more unhappy than they used to be, because their whole worldview has changed and their whole life changed because of money. I think there's even a science and data behind this now, showing that after a certain point of money, you don't become more happy, because it probably implies more troubles, which I can agree with. More money, more problem. He said it the best. What was it, Biggie? Another interesting topic around this as well is expansionism, where Socrates says this city will not expand beyond a certain point, because by limiting the size of the city, they can make sure that it can maintain its ruling. There's so many examples in history. We had Napoleon, the constant expanding, eventually leading to its demise. And I think the same thing ties in with gold as well. When you have it, you just want more and more of it, eventually leading to your own destruction. Now we're on book 5, everyone. I haven't mentioned this, but basically there's 10 books of the Republic, but they can sort of be seen as chapters instead. And it gets even more strange at this point. Socrates brings up the topic of selective procreation, where another great lie that will be told by the state, which is that everyone's partner will be determined through a lottery, state lottery, where basically your sexual partner is completely by chance, or so they will be told. Of course, the state will instead put together the most desirable or admirable people that they want more of in this city, to breed the best kind of people in the city, and also avoid any form of incest. Follow the same storyline in Sovietins, where everyone has their set partner in this dystopia. In book 5 as well, we get to hear a little bit of Plato's ideas around feminism, which is not the best way to put it. I think most people don't think that Socrates or Plato had any sort of ideas we have today, but he recognizes that men and women are different by nature, but in terms of ruling, who can be a ruler, he sees no difference between a man and a woman, and that they are both fit for the role. I think even now, most people aren't too used to women being in a leadership, but again, 2,000 years ago, Socrates recognized that there is no difference, which can be seen as a sort of progressive thought to put forward, especially with the mind of how poorly women were treated back in ancient Greek. I think all they had to do was stay at home all day taking care of the house, and they were generally treated poorly, as far as I know. But then again, you could also just see it as recognizing that women can get what men already have. So who then are the most fit to rule this city? I'll let you guess. That's right, Philosophers. I gotta say, Socrates, they're a little bit of an elitist. It really feels like. So, since philosophers, they seek truth above all else, and therefore their rational part of the soul will rule the city, and best rule the city. So, Socrates has a very interesting view of leadership, which in a way I agree with, but it's also extremely pessimistic. He says that if you look at how we determine a leader in a democracy, it is a very long process to go through with. Anyone that wants to become a leader is up for a tremendous task of going through a public election. It's not something that anyone is willing to go through with. To become a leader in our democracy, you must truly want to become a leader. And Socrates argues that the one most fitted to rule is the one that wants to rule the least. And he brings up this example of a boat where a couple of seamen or a couple of seafarers are on this boat. They're traveling to this destination, but everyone is arguing over who should steer the ship, whilst the one who is most fit to steer the ship is the one focusing on the stars, and they're looking at the stars to try and navigate instead. But the person most fit to steer the ship is the one focusing on what they need to do to steer the ship instead of arguing why they should steer the ship. Therefore, according to Socrates, the one who wants to rule the least is the most appropriate to rule. But they will also never become the ruler because they don't seek it. And this is pessimistic in the sense that it implies that the ship cannot make it to the shore, even if people are arguing, which is obviously not the case. Next up, we get into metaphysics, which I find a little hard to understand. Socrates recognizes the world as something that can be described beyond our senses. He uses math as an example. 2 + 2 will always be 4, no matter where you are in the universe, when certain things, according to our eyes and our vision and our senses, will appear differently depending on our subjective manners. It's a color red for everyone. You understand what I mean. But 2 + 2 will always be 4. Socrates brings up here in book 7 the most famous metaphor in philosophy, or Western philosophy at least. Socrates brings up the allegory of the cave as a way to describe education. I want you to try and imagine a very dark cave, and in this cave there are a couple people in a row, and these people are completely immobilized. They cannot move any inch of their body. They cannot move their head. Imagine Clockwork Orange style, strapped down to this in this cave with chains. The only thing these people can see is the cave wall in front of them. Now this wall has a bunch of shadows cast upon them because there is a light behind them, and in front of this light there are people crossing a bridge. So what the prisoners in the chains can see on the wall are just shadows of these people moving back and forth. And since these people have never experienced anything else in their life, for them, and what their senses are telling them, is that these shadows are real because they don't know any other truth. So eventually, in this allegory of the cave, one of the prisoners managed to escape his chains, and his worldview is, of course, then completely changed. He sees people that are real. He sees a whole new dimension, essentially. And Socrates describes this experience as very painful, something very painful to go through, but eventually a satisfying experience. But the prisoner isn't completely free yet, and he managed to escape the cave in itself, where he eventually gets blinded by the sun. Again, a very painful experience, but once it's calmed down, he recognizes the sun. The light brings all things into existence. He sees the flowers, he sees the trees. The sun represents the form of good, basically. And the point of education is to drag a person out of this cave, to see things how they actually really are, and not just feeding information to you. Not everyone can escape this cave, and therefore Socrates thinks that the person who escaped the cave needs to come back. The philosopher king needs to come back from the cave to rule. In book 8, Socrates steps back from describing the republic or the city, and he instead takes some time to describe different forms of regimes. He describes a timocracy, an oligarchy, a democracy, and finally a tyranny. But I think what's important here is how he notes that each one of these different rulings are worse than the other, and that in the last stage, which is when democracy, the most free form of city that there is, will eventually fall into tyranny, the most limited, least free city. Socrates says that the desire for freedom will eventually lead to not having proper rulers. It will give the chance for a tyrant to rise. And I think it's very, very interesting how accurately Socrates depicts the rise of the tyrant 2,000 years ago, more than 2,000 years ago. He accurately depicts something that has already happened to us many times. You have the example of Saddam Hussein, who our last known tyrant, who rose to power through democracy. And he started off by doing a lot of good for its people. Much like other tyrants of our time, Benito Mussolini, for example, who famously made the trains run on time. Saddam helped modernize infrastructure. He helped modernize industries, healthcare system, education, different social services, farming. Same with Hitler. The tyrant starts from a democracy and does good for its people. But as Socrates describes, the tyrant who is ruled by its desires will eventually get the taste of blood. He will do something to an opposition. He will execute one of his enemies, and he will do this in the name of the people. He will do it as, I've done something to protect you, not me. And once he had the taste of blood, that will just be the start of it. The tyrant who is ruled by his lust and desires will not just bleed the city dry, but will become paranoid and kill all their enemies. This lust of blood will continue. Anyone challenging his position will, of course, be executed. And this is what happened to Saddam Hussein. A lot of, in the end of his regime, his military power was very poor because he had executed anyone, and most of his best men just out of sheer paranoia. Socrates argues that the least happy man in the world is this ruling tyrant, which actually starts to make a lot of sense if you think about it. Constantly living in this fear, this paranoia, driven by your greed and lust. You can't trust your friends, constant fear of enemies. Saddam even himself had to move where he lived every single day to protect himself. So not only is the ruling tyrant the least happy, it's also the worst ruling for a city. For example, Iraq used to be so much richer before the time of Saddam Hussein. And Socrates draws the opposite line, that the just man is the happiest man and the unjust man is the least happy man. So then who is the most happy man? Well, of course, you could probably guess. That's right, the philosopher, everyone. Is according to Socrates, the one seeking truth is the greatest pleasure of them all. And only a philosopher will know this because he's experienced all the pleasures. Finally, we made it to the end, book 10, where Socrates brings up the view of the afterlife. He talks about the myth of Er, which is a warrior who died in battle, and he then goes to the afterlife has a bunch of people in it, kind of like an airport. And he sees how the system works, and basically people will have to serve 1,000 years in heaven or 1,000 years in hell based on how you lived your life. This is where you go. But after serving this 1,000 years, you will then get to pick a new life again. And here again, according to Socrates, only this philosopher will know how to pick the right life. I think it's very interesting because just like this natural progression of different type of ruling, so will the person, the individual, go through the natural progression between good and evil themselves. They will not always make the right decision of what life they want to live, and only the philosopher knows which life is the right choice. He picks this life of a philosopher, an ordinary man who minds his own business. And that is the definition of justice according to Socrates or Plato. Minding your own business and not meddling with other men's concerns. I think Plato's Republic is such a phenomenal piece of literature. It makes me happy that I'm alive to even experience it, just from the sake of taking part of these ideas that were written so long ago. It discusses ideas that are still very much relevant today in a way that is still very engaging and exciting, and I love reading this book. I don't think I would have taken so much time with it otherwise. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching it. I would obviously give it 10 out of 10. I would love to hear your thoughts in the discussion of the comments section or on the Reddit. I'll see you guys there. Goodbye.